munitions. Basically, they were on a suicide mission. And they terrified the Americans at first. Anyway, the kamikaze, but this kamikaze was otherwise called Divine Wind. The Divine Wind destroyed Kublai Khan's fleet. And not enough of the fleet was left to go in and conquer Japan, so what little was left of it had to return home. And to make a long story short, Japan was never conquered by China. Anyway, the Mongolians also went and temporarily conquered Vietnam, as we'll talk about later, but Vietnam resorted to guerrilla warfare, and the Mongolians were not particularly good at that kind of fighting. The Mongolians also were not particularly good at fighting in the jungle either, even as the Muslims were not. All right. Moving on now from the political history. Oh yes, something else that the Chinese invented. They invented gunpowder. They taught the use of gunpowder to the Mongolians, and it turned out the Mongolians used the gunpowder against them. They didn't use the gunpowder so much as rifles or pistols, but more like what we call grenades. They put this gunpowder in a container, and then light the fuse in the container and throw the container at the enemy, and it would blow up, very similar to a grenade. But this was very effective, and the Mongolians were able to use it against the Chinese, and the Chinese were the ones who had invented it. All right, now, as was the case of so many places, the main religion was threatened. Now, the main religion was Confucianism for a time. But Confucianism was threatened by two religions, Buddhism from without and Taoism from within. Eventually, though, Confucianism triumphed because it decided that, well, the problem we're having is that both Buddhism and Taoism are more spiritual than we are, and what Confucianism was lacking was any spirituality. So Confucianism pretended to become more spiritual, and by so doing, they were able to kind of edge out both Taoism and Buddhism, and eventually Confucianism became the undisputed dominant religion of China. Now, something else I must mention about China too, the civil service exam. The Chinese emperors decided two things. Number one, they wanted control over who got the offices. Okay, before the invention of the radio, the telephone, or the internet, these emperors had to rule through the nobility. I mean, China is a very large territory, so the Chinese emperor would send a certain individual, say, you take over this part, or you take that. But then, when that person died, the emissary that sent died, who was to take the place? Well, they decided that oftentimes the oldest son was not capable of qualified, so they devised a series of tests called the civil service exam. The civil service exam. Now, I had a pupil ask me one time, how do you know that a high score on a test will guarantee that a person make a good ruler? The answer is you can't. Anyway, but they did not want to get a person who was who is less than intelligent. So basically, the civil service exam was where that if you passed it, you qualified for a government position. And then you take the higher level test after you pass the one, and if you pass that one, you can qualify for a higher position still. And supposedly a high test score would guarantee that you could be a good civil servant. It didn't always work out that way, but the emperors hoped to gain control by this means also, but seeing that only certain type of people got in. The civil service exam was on 3 levels: entry level, intermediate level, and advanced level. Now, here was the problem with them, and your book mentions it. Number one, there were no public schools. Guess what? Only the rich could afford to educate their children, so only the rich had any chance of passing the exam. Number two, there was some cheating on the exams. This is known. Now, then number 3. The Chinese emperors decided they only wanted a certain type of person, so the exams became slanted toward Confucianism. All right. Now, at this point, many, many years ago, I had a pupil run off and tell me, I'm going to say again what I said then. In our own country today, our national teacher exam, I know this to be true, and our graduate record exam are slanted toward the left to help guarantee that only liberals get high up. Now, that doesn't necessarily happen on your level yet, but when you get out of college and start thinking about going to graduate school, they expect their graduate students to be leftist, socialistic. Now this, I believe, is even more true now than it was when I was younger. But I had a teacher advise me one time, give the most liberal answer you can when you're taking these tests. And generally that's the answer they want. Back to China now. Yeah, that someone told on me. I told my department that my students may know that I'm conservative. I said I do not grade based on that. I had a Vietnamese communist in my class one time, and he made an A in the class. I've had other socialistic liberals, including one I had who wound up knowing that he knew my son. My son knew him. He made an A in the class. You don't have to agree with me to get a grade in my class, because my tests are not slanted. But the Chinese, they slanted their tests to help guarantee that Confucian people, and you had to memorize large portions of Confucius' writings to pass. Anyway, the civil service exam was ahead of its time. We still have them today, but Europeans did not develop a civil service exam until the 1800s. We still give the civil service test to help qualify you for a government job. Also, something, not everyone who passed the exam was given a government position. There had to be an opening. All right. China was mostly a farming area, agricultural, during most of this time, and it remains so. And here, all right, let me tell you something, folks. I mean, hopefully we'll liven up the lesson a bit. Our country is having a high rate of people commit suicide. But one of the highest rates are America's farmers. Farmers are committing, and also, if that's not enough, when today's farmers, most of whom are my age or maybe a little bit younger, older than I am, once they're gone, who is going to farm their farms? The young people of today are not the least bit interested in farming. We look down on the farmers being country hippies. I went to a country school, Madison High School by name, and when we play other teams, they call us farm boys. That was a derogatory term. The Chinese, though, were backwards. They looked on the merchants as being the low class. They were the filthy, greedy persons, and the farmers were the upper. That was one thing that's believed to have kept the Chinese from advancing. They did not value trade very highly. They did not value the merchants very highly. Anyway, I've already mentioned that the Tang Dynasty took land from the rich and redistributed among the poor folk. The Koreans did this. Tiberius Gracchus in Rome advocated it, but it wasn't done. Solon in Greece refused to do this, said it wouldn't work. Solon might have been right. But anyway, the Tang Dynasty took the land from the rich, gave it to the poor, and in short order the rich gobbled it up and got it all back again, while the poor remained even poorer still for having lost their land. All right. Now, oh yes, your book talks about, oh yeah, something else that's began to happen here. With women in China, females were looked on as being inferior, and to keep the women subservient, they began this practice of foot binding. Foot binding was where they would take young girls about a year old and put a shoe on their foot to guarantee that their foot would not grow. Now, there were a couple of purposes of this. Number one, it was the most recent thing I read on it was to keep the women from running off, from leaving. But also, I've heard it was to make the women more attractive to men by making their legs have a different shape and make the women look more attractive. And the nearest thing we have to in the West is the practice of wearing high-heeled shoes. I once asked my mother, why do you women wear high-heeled shoes? She said, oh, it gives the women more slender ankles and makes the women more attractive to men. I do notice that women today do not tend to wear high heels, and I'm glad of it, because women would have problems in my day with things like ingrown toenails, corns, bunions, fallen arches, plantar warts. I hope none of you have any idea what I'm talking about. In case you do, too bad. But anyway, the women would have problems, and I've had ingrown toenail surgery 4 times. My son has had it also, and I've had problem with plantar warts myself.
Stop binding your feet.
That's right.
Or wearing high heels.
Stop wearing high heels and
Yeah.
stop. But anyway, the Chinese had the practice. The practice of foot binding was to continue up until the communists took over and outlawed it around 1950. And that was a year after I was born, the Chinese government. But some people in the Chinese countryside continue to do it. And until if you go to China, if you look at the right places, there are still a few Chinese women around who've had their foot bound. But the practice has since been outlawed. But it began here. Again, the idea was to, among other things, to keep the Chinese women more subservient. Now we come to the Chinese philosophy. I've already mentioned how that Taoism and Buddhism threatened Confucianism, but eventually a new religion came on the scene called Neo-Confucianism. Neo-Confucianism, and they had a couple of really high-level philosophers. The most famous one was Chu Ci. That's pronounced, I believe, Chu Ci. Now, Chu Ci said that we could find fulfillment through the investigation of things. Now, all right, now I want to tell you before I get any farther, he is number 2 of Chinese philosophers behind only Confucius. It's Confucius first and Chu Ci next, and then Mencius, Confucius follower after that. Chu Ci compiled all the philosophical books he could get his hand on into one big set of thick volumes. Now, what did he mean by investigation? And folk, here's where I'm thinking to myself as I read it, the Chinese now are on their way. They're going to start investigating. And I can't help but think of George Washington Carver, who investigated 2 things, the peanut and the soybean, and came up with all kinds of plastics and all kinds of gadgets for them, especially peanut butter. He also came with a peanut ice cream, which if you go to Plains, Georgia, they still sell some of his peanut ice cream that he made. Of course, George Washington Carver was not doing it to find spiritual fulfillment. George Washington Carver, for those of you who know, was a convinced Christian. Very strong Christian. But he was doing this now in order to find spiritual fulfillment. But later, one of his followers said, I studied the bamboo shoot for hours. I looked at it, and I did not fill me with anything, spiritual fulfillment. Well, I believe if George Washington Carver studied the bamboo shoot, he'd come up with bamboo peanut butter, bamboo oil, and bamboo plastic, and whatever else, bamboo cloth. Whatever else you might come up with bamboo. But again, I was thinking the Chinese are almost on their way, but they didn't. Chu Ci went on to get a government position. He was really sharp and passed the government test. What may have prolonged his life as long as it did, he became what we might call a college professor, which got him out of the mainstream and kept him out of trouble for a while. But then he got a job at a government position near the emperor's court. He saw a lot of corruption in the emperor's court, which he spoke out against. Bad news for him, the emperor had him executed. But as is the case of a lot of people who get executed when they expose corruption or when they speak for corruption and offend somebody, within 2 generations he was revived. I mean, not revived physically, but his memory was revived, and he became China's #2 philosopher behind Confucius. Another Chinese philosopher is Yang Wangmang, who studied under Chu Si. He was a neo-Confucian also. He disagreed with Chu Si, and he said the best way to understand the material world was understand yourself. Yang Wangmang, understanding of self. The problem again is folks studying him later don't know exactly what he meant. And of course, if you go into Yang Wangmang more detail, he believed that there was the material world and a spiritual world, and we were right there in between. Be that as it may, I'm not going to get deeper into that, but be that as it may, Neo-Confucianism eventually died out. It was replaced by the standard Confucianism. Now, here's where we have to wonder, and I know it's break time. What went wrong with China? I mean, by any account, I mean they were far, far ahead of the West. Where did they go wrong? Well, a lot of people believe it was the philosophers. The philosophers emphasized morality, and hey, folk, I got a lot to say about morality, but more I'm thinking about morality. Morality is like the brakes on a car. The brakes will not get you anywhere. Now, don't say that you can drive without brakes. But if you're trying to put a car together and all you do is emphasize the brakes for safety, you're going to get nowhere. Morality by itself gets you nowhere. You need an engine. To get somewhere in a car, you have to have the engine and the brakes working together in harmony. The engine can't say to the brakes, hey, you're stopping everything we do. We don't need you. Get out of our way, you brakes. No, you're going to crash. Got to work together. So you have to have morality. But morality by itself will get you nowhere. Reminds me of something that St. Paul has said. The works of the law, keeping the law, does not justify. I mean, the same thing. You have to have an engine. Anyway, the Chinese philosophers emphasized morality more so than they did they did not emphasize technological advances. Again, I think that part of the problem with China was that they were united. If they had been divided, one of the groups might have, again, if you favor, we're all the same, we're all one world, let's let everybody in. You and I are different. I mean, because I don't think so. I mean, I was listening to a YouTube video a few nights ago, and this man from California was saying that, where he terribly disagreed with Trump was, let's not build a wall, let's build a bridge. Let's let everybody in, because he said, we're all God's children. You might think so too, but I don't. There are some people who are going to do everything they can to destroy and hinder and tear down, and you've got to separate yourself from those kind. If that offends you, nothing I can do about it. Okay, folks, be back in about 10 minutes.